Hubert's voice trembled with disbelief upon realizing that Gislin had officially become a lord over half of Diggle County. Though as Tower Master he held status equivalent to a count, Hubert reluctantly agreed to treat the newly minted Baron Fenris with casual respect, formally shaking hands to cement their new alliance. Gislin took his leave, fully aware that establishing a Crimson Flame Tower branch inside his domain was the only way to save the mages from falling to the rival Scarlet Tower in the future. Returning to Ferdium, Gislin quickly packed his belongings and ordered Jillian to lead Vanessa, the mages, and Kalwar ahead to secure and manage the Fenris estate. Instead of joining them immediately, Gislin announced he was taking a small escort, including a persistent Belinda and Jillian, to Ostern in the neighboring kingdom of Seiron. Ignoring Belinda's suspicion that he was indulging in his old habit of high-stakes gambling, Gislin secretly intended to recruit Claude, his brilliant razor-tongued chief strategist from his past life as the king of mercenaries. Knowing that Claude's unmatched tactical genius was currently being wasted in gambling dens, Gislin was determined to intervene before the man suffered the horrific injuries, a severed hand and crippled leg, that had permanently maimed him in the previous timeline. Arriving in the bustling, brightly lit gambling city of Ostern, Gislin led his group straight into the massive Kraken game hall, a notorious den he had once completely flattened in his past life. Inside, the atmosphere was tense, and Gislin overheard patrons gossiping that Claude had just been caught pulling a fast one and dragged off by a local gang leader named Crank. Realizing with a sudden, hardened focus that today was the exact day Claude was destined to lose his hand. Gislin clearly remembered the name Crank, having heard his former strategist cursed relentlessly during late-night drinking sessions in his past life. Recognizing that today was the exact date Claude was destined to be maimed, Gislin demanded the game hall staff lead him to Crank immediately. When three lounging thugs tried to extort a preposterous errand fee for the meeting, Gislin casually severed the leader's wrist with a blinding sword strike. With his mercenaries slamming the remaining thugs into the blood-soaked table, Gislin drove his blade into the leader's shoulder, using the terrified man as a human GPS as they raced toward a filthy slaughterhouse on the outskirts of Ostern. Arriving at the stench-filled slaughterhouse, Gislin ordered Jillian to subdue the external guards while he breached the main doors, just as Crank was raising a hand axe over a bound Claude. Ignoring the gang leader's confused protests, Gislin shattered a thug's dagger barehanded, swatted another into a wall, and used threads of mana to twist and break the limbs of a dozen charging men simultaneously. A horrified Crank fell to his knees, utterly unable to comprehend whether the intruder was a monstrous knight or an impossible battle mage, while Claude stared in shock at the miraculous rescue. Gislin introduced himself as Baron Fenris, untied the bound strategist, and dismissed Crank's claims that Claude had been caught cheating. Handing the terrified gang leader a few gold coins for medical bills, Gislin yanked Crank by the collar and whispered a chilling, lethal promise to slaughter the entire gang if they attempted to track them. Leaving the traumatized backstreet boss behind, Gislin led Claude out into the cool night air, staring at his savior with hollow, lifeless eyes that reminded Gislin of a young Jillian. The exhausted strategist bowed in gratitude before dryly asking if the foreign baron would buy him a drink. Despite Jillian reprimanding Claude for his brazen disrespect toward Baron Fenris, Claude remained defiantly indifferent, daring them to kill him if they disliked his attitude. Jillian recognized that same hollow, hopeless glare from his own past, while Gislin smoothly defended Claude, aware that the man was masking severe emotional trauma. Dragging the reluctant, suspicious strategist to a lavish tavern, Gislin hosted his mercenaries while Belinda watched in disbelief, questioning why Gislin kept intentionally surrounding himself with flawed, damaged individuals like a self-destructive gambling addict. At the table, Claude drank excessively to numb his broken mental state, noting that Gislin shared his taste for rare luxury wines like Red Dragon. When Gislin directly offered him total management of his estate, Claude laughed in bitter disbelief at the absurdity of placing a drunk, bankrupt gambler in charge of a noble domain. Claude confessed that he had lost all money, health, knowledge, and will to live, bound by inescapable metaphorical shackles after failing to achieve his dreams. However, Gislin firmly promised to break those shackles, declaring with absolute certainty that he always gets what he wants regardless of the obstacles. Testing Gislin's claim that money was the easiest problem to solve, Claude sarcastically demanded a sum so massive it would crush an average barony, asking to be bought out for 2,000 gold. Eavesdropping nearby, Belinda was outraged by the staggering demand and stood up to shout, attempting to give Gislin an excuse to reject the scam and save face. However, Gislin genuinely looked disappointed by the low figure, casually scoffing that only requesting 2,000 gold, rather than 5,000, was far less than he had anticipated and barely a scratch on his actual wealth. Claude, furious, demanded Gislin stop mocking him. Gislin calmly reiterated his willingness to provide the funds, noting that the required amount had surprisingly decreased from the 5,000 gold Claude had sought in his previous life. Claude sarcastically upped his request to 2,500 gold to test the noble's bluff, provoking an angry outburst from Belinda that Gislin quickly silenced. Despite Jillian's cautious reservations, Gislin dispatched him to fetch the vice president of Austern's largest merchant guild, gently reminding his chief knight that he too had once been a hopeless recluse before being given a second chance. When the greedy guild leader arrived expecting collateral from the modestly dressed foreign noble, Gislin's mercenaries produced a glowing top-grade runestone that left the merchant thoroughly entranced. Gislin rejected the guild leader's desperate pleas to purchase more stones and instructed him to issue 2 separate magical credit notes totaling 2,500 gold for Claude. A stunned, trembling Claude took the fortune he had spent years fruitlessly chasing through gambling, realizing that a complete stranger had handed him his life's dream without asking for repayment terms or collateral. Overwhelmed and desperate to fulfill his secret objective, Claude snatched the credit notes and bolted from the tavern like a fugitive. While the mercenaries assumed he was fleeing to a gambling den, Gislin calmly led them directly to the estate of Baron Austern, arriving just as Claude was frantically trying to bribe his way past the guards to fulfill a prior pact with the greedy lord. Gislin stepped in, posing as Claude's friend, to protect the strategist from being quietly robbed and murdered inside the manor by the corrupt baron. Once admitted into the main hall, Claude threw himself onto the floor, groveling before the bloated, murky-eyed Baron Austern and begging to exchange the fortune that had been taken from him. Groveling on his knees, a trembling Claude offered the 2,000 gold credit note to reclaim a captive woman, only for the greedy Baron Austern to break his promise and demand 3,000 gold instead, citing rising costs. When a desperate Claude added his remaining 500 gold and revealed he was leaving Cyron to work for a noble in Rutania, the Baron attempted to squeeze both men for even more money. Sick of the extortion, Gislin unleashed a crushing wave of pressure, unlocking his second and third cores to drag a sword-wielding knight across the hall with mana threads and break his wrist barehanded. Threatening to slaughter every guard in the castle, Gislin completely terrified the helpless knights and forced the cornered Baron to back down. When Baron Austern sullenly agreed to accept the original 2,000 gold, Gislin turned the tables by demanding a 3,000 gold ransom for the knight's life, trapping the Baron in a public loyalty test he couldn't refuse. Forced to write off the 2,000 gold and pay the difference, the humiliated Baron ordered his guards to fetch the woman while Gislin reclaimed the credit note and pulled Claude to his feet, leaving the audience chamber with a final mocking invitation for the Baron to visit him at the Fenris estate. Baron Austern gasped in disbelief as Gislin walked out of the room without another word, though an enraged shout soon echoed behind the closed door as the greedy lord realized Gislin was actually a noble of Rutania. Rejoining his mercenaries in the castle lounge, Gislin playfully brushed off Belinda's confusion over their guide's grim expression, assuring her that everything had gone smoothly while they waited outside. Shortly after, 2 knights brought out a shabby, haggard young woman named Anna, who immediately broke down in tears upon recognizing her long-lost fiancé Claude. As the couple wept in each other's arms, Gislin revealed the truth to his stunned mercenaries. Claude had been framed by political enemies of his master, the late dean of the Cyron Royal Academy, into delivering forged evidence tying the dean to the radical revolutionary group. Traumatized by guilt over his master's execution, the ruin of his bright future, and Anna being sold off to cover the debt, Claude had descended into gambling in a desperate, self-destructive bid to raise her ransom. Moving to a luxury VIP inn suite, Ghislaine sat down with Claude for a private conversation, explaining with complete sincerity that he was helping because he owed Claude an unpayable debt from his past life. Rather than forcing him into service, Ghislaine offered a surprising alternative, telling Claude he was entirely free to take Anna and his remaining 500 gold to live a peaceful life without owing anything in return. Overwhelmed by Ghislaine's profound trust, Claude knelt to formally pledge his eternal loyalty to Baron Fenris, asking only that Anna be safely escorted to the academy so he could devote his mind fully to Ghislaine's service. Anna stood outside the inn clutching the 500 gold credit note, her face desperate and filled with tearful anxiety as she pleaded with Gordon and the escorting mercenaries to see Claude one last time. From a hidden vantage point, Claude watched her break down with a self-deprecating smile, quietly explaining to Belinda that while he loved Anna, their presence together would only drag up the agonizing memories of his master's death. Though Belinda tried to convince him that running away wasn't the answer, she couldn't bring herself to push further after realizing the heavy guilt haunted both of them. When Ghislaine asked if he regretted his past mistakes, Claude admitted his deep shame over becoming a broken gambling addict, declaring that he would never fall for such shallow schemes again. Reassured by Claude's shift in perspective, Ghislaine warmly welcomed his talent, reassuring him that despite his light-hearted complaints, he expected great things from him. Satisfied that Anna would be safe at the Saron Royal Academy, fulfilling her father's final wishes, Claude turned his back on his past regrets, ready to step forward into a new life. As soon as Anna departed, Ghislaine's group set off for the Fenris estate in the Rutena kingdom. On the journey, Claude secretly assumed that anyone who threw around thousands of gold coins so casually must be the heir to an ultra-wealthy duke. Expecting a thriving, magnificent domain, Claude's confidence turned to confusion as they crossed the border into desolate, poverty-stricken lands. Utterly disgusted by the state of the local villages, Claude passionately lectured Ghislaine on how the local lord was an incompetent, corrupt monster whose head should be chopped off. His blood ran cold when Belinda casually revealed that they had been riding through Ghislaine's own domain the entire time, and that his father was the Margrave of Ferdium, a region infamous for monster attacks and extreme poverty. Horrified to realize he had repeatedly insulted his new lord's territory directly to his face, Claude tried to awkwardly step backward and flee back to Anna, only for Ghislaine's mercenaries to instantly block every escape route. Slinging an arm around the trembling strategist, Ghislaine offered a devilish grin, warmly promising that they were going to do great things together now that Claude was trapped in his service. Arriving at Fenris Castle, Ghislaine and his group were greeted by a desolate wasteland of malnourished, despondent citizens and demoralized guards who had completely given up on life after years of relentless exploitation under the previous lord. While Claude viewed the ruined domain as a monumental, high-stakes project to prove his intellectual brilliance, relying on Ghislaine's vast runestone wealth to fund the development, he remained completely oblivious to Ghislaine's secret, grand ambition to wage war against the powerful Delphine Duchy. Inside the castle, Ghislaine immediately gathered the anxious estate officials, banning wasteful celebratory banquets and ordering a complete restructuring of the administrative council. To everyone's absolute shock, Ghislaine sequentially assigned Claude a comical mountain of high-level responsibilities: chief overseer, treasurer, intelligence officer, head of foreign affairs, magistrate, chief strategist, special development director, chief justice, quartermaster, and merchant guild leader. Realizing Ghislaine was literally working him to death to settle his debt, a sweating, trembling Claude hilariously attempted to resign on the spot to reunite with Anna, only for Ghislaine to firmly reject him. When Belinda and Jillian raised doubts about Claude's capabilities, roasting his history as a lazy, ruined gambling addict, the surrounding managers began staring with open distrust. Seizing the opportunity to assert himself, Claude caught the aggressive glare of Kaor, the mercenary who had been left in charge of estate security. Undeterred by the soldier's fierce demeanor, Claude covertly flashed extremely offensive, vulgar hand gestures at Kaor from behind his back. Unable to handle the blatant disrespect, an enraged Kaor finally snapped, drawing his sword and charging straight at the Claude. Jillian intercepted the strike with his axe, sparking an aggressive quarrel between the two mercenaries that Belinda found hilarious. Ghislaine halted the dispute by embedding a thrown sword between them, secretly enjoying the wild, unrefined camaraderie that reminded him of his past mercenary life, even as the estate's proper officials looked on in utter horror at the complete lack of decorum. Dismissing their concerns, Ghislaine reassured everyone that Claude was more than capable of handling the mountain of responsibilities, leaving Claude resigned to his fate and forced to accept the staggering workload. Ghislaine then turned his attention to the estate's dire military standing, learning that only 32 soldiers remained after the war. Appointing Belinda as head steward and leaving Jillian and Kyor to oversee the mercenaries, Ghislaine immediately began barking a relentless, overwhelming flood of orders at Claude, demanding a full population census, massive 6-month food imports, road and castle wall repairs, military supply overhauls, new sanitation systems, and resource hoarding. Realizing he was expected to overhaul the entire domain simultaneously without adequate staff, a panicked Claude tried to refuse, shouting that he would rather be beheaded than die of overwork. When Ghislaine casually motioned for Kyor to execute him, Claude panicked, realizing his new lord was completely insane. Overwhelmed by the terrifying reality of his endless enslavement to the impoverished estate, something snapped inside Claude's mind, and the Claude fainted dead on the floor. Waking up from his faint without losing his head, Claude woke up in a quiet room, instantly missing his lazy lifestyle and dreading the mountain of work awaiting him. His complaints were cut short by Wendy, a calm maid assigned by Belinda to guard and supervise him. When Claude mockingly questioned her combat skills, Wendy instantly pinned a cockroach to the wall with a thrown dagger, coldly informing him that he was expected to wash up immediately and start working. Forced into compliance under Wendy's watchful eye, Claude finally made his way to his office, where stacks of neglected estate paperwork and Ghislaine's massive orders awaited him. Over the next few days, Claude worked himself to exhaustion, losing weight while trying to figure out a way to fix the barren, penniless Fenris estate. Recognizing that Ghislaine's runestones would eventually run out and leave the territory unable to pay for facility maintenance, Claude devised a grand plan to generate income. Escorted by Wendy, Claude deliberately walked slowly to the Great Hall to enjoy a brief moment of prestige as the estate's second-in-command. However, when Claude attempted to be friendly by winking at the hot-tempered Kyor, the mercenary flew into a rage and drew his sword again, triggering a chaotic standoff among the guards Belinda and Jillian that was only quelled when Ghislaine released a surge of suppressing mana. Once order was restored, Claude presented his assessment to Ghislaine, arguing that the land was far too infertile to generate agricultural taxes or sustain the expensive facilities Ghislaine ordered. He bluntly pointed out that without a steady revenue source, the estate was doomed to fail regardless of how many runestones they spent. When Ghislaine asked if he had a solution to bring in fast money, Claude proudly announced his brilliant idea to open a massive gambling hall, only to be instantly kicked in the face by Belinda.